On February 26, 1945, a German Tiger tank lay in ambush near the town of Elsdorf, Germany. Its commander watched through his periscope as an unfamiliar shape approached, a new American tank he had never seen before. The Tiger crew had grown accustomed to easy kills against Shermans, their 88mm gun destroying American armor at ranges where return fire bounced harmlessly off their 100mm of frontal steel. But this American tank was different. It was larger, heavier, with a long-barreled gun that looked disturbingly similar to their own 88. Before the Tiger commander could react, a round traveling at over 3,000 feet per second punched through his frontal armor. The shell that killed his tank was something the Germans had dismissed as American desperation, a strange projectile that used exotic metals and impossible velocities. They had mocked it as a weapon that could never be produced in meaningful quantities. They were only half right. The roots of the American armor crisis stretched back years before this moment. In the laboratories and proving grounds of Aberdeen, Maryland, American ordnance officers had known since late 1942 that their tank guns faced a fundamental problem. The standard 75mm M3 gun mounted on the Sherman could penetrate roughly 70mm of homogeneous armor plate at 500 yards under ideal conditions. The German Tiger I heavy tank, which had entered service that same year, carried 100mm of frontal armor on its hull, and even more on its distinctive boxy turret. The mathematics of armor penetration were brutal and simple. American tankers could not kill Tigers from the front at any realistic combat range. They would have to close to suicidal distances or find flanking shots on the thinner side and rear armor, assuming they survived long enough to maneuver. The Tiger was not merely heavily armored. It mounted the legendary 88mm KWK-36 gun, a weapon derived from the famous Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun that had devastated Allied armor in North Africa. This gun could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, well beyond the distance at which American crews could effectively return fire. A single Tiger properly positioned could theoretically destroy an entire American tank platoon before any of them could close to effective range. The tactical implications were terrifying. American tankers would face an enemy they could not hurt while that enemy killed them with impunity. But the crisis ran deeper than mere ballistics. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces and one of the most influential officers in the American military establishment, had built American armored doctrine on a fundamental assumption that would cost thousands of lives. Tanks, McNair insisted with unshakable conviction, existed to exploit breakthroughs and pursue retreating enemies. They were cavalry in steel bodies, meant to sweep through gaps in enemy lines and wreak havoc in rear areas. They were not meant to fight other tanks. That job belonged to specialized tank destroyers, towed anti-tank guns, aircraft, and massed artillery. The tank versus tank duel, McNair believed, was an aberration that proper combined arms tactics would render unnecessary. This was not stupidity. McNair was a thoughtful officer who had studied armored warfare extensively. His doctrine emerged from careful analysis of the early war years, particularly the German campaigns in Poland and France, where tanks had succeeded not through head-to-head combat but through operational maneuver. German panzers had avoided strong points, exploited weaknesses, and achieved victory through speed and shock rather than slugging matches. McNair concluded that American tanks needed mobility and reliability more than heavy armor and big guns. A medium tank that could be shipped in large numbers, maintained in the field, and produced in American factories by the tens of thousands would be more valuable than a handful of heavy tanks that broke down constantly and could not cross European bridges. When subordinates urged him to develop heavier tanks with bigger guns, McNair refused. He viewed such proposals as wasteful diversions from the true mission of armor. In a letter to General Jacob Devers written in the fall of 1943, McNair articulated his position with characteristic bluntness. There could be no basis for the T-26 tank, he wrote, other than the conception of a tank versus tank duel, which is believed unsound and unnecessary. The T-26, which would eventually become the Pershing, sat in development limbo while McNair argued that deploying it would waste resources and encourage tankers to engage in the very tank duels that doctrine sought to avoid. This doctrinal rigidity had concrete consequences that would be paid in American blood. The T-26 heavy tank program stalled repeatedly throughout 1943 and early 1944. Army ground forces actually requested that the T-26 be armed with the same 76mm gun mounted on upgraded Shermans rather than the more powerful 90mm, deliberately handicapping what should have been America's answer to the Tiger and Panther. The 90mm gun, derived from an anti-aircraft weapon similar to the German 88, offered dramatically superior penetration. But McNair's headquarters worried that mounting such a weapon would encourage exactly the tank versus tank combat they wanted to avoid. The debate might have continued indefinitely had events not intervened. McNair would die on July 25, 1944, killed by friendly fire during Operation Cobra when American bombers dropped their loads short of German lines and into the assembly areas of American troops. His death removed the most powerful obstacle to American heavy tank development, but his doctrine would outlive him. The organizational momentum he had built continued to delay the Pershing until the final months of the war, ensuring that American tankers would face Panthers and Tigers with inadequate weapons for nearly the entire campaign in Western Europe. The ammunition crisis emerged from this same bureaucratic obstruction of new technology. American designers at the Ordnance Department had actually developed a superior armor-piercing round years before the invasion of France. The high-velocity armor-piercing shell, designated HVAP in American nomenclature, represented a fundamentally different approach to defeating armor. Traditional armor-piercing shells relied on a solid steel body that punched through armor plate using mass and hardness. The HVAP round used a subcaliber tungsten carbide core wrapped in a lightweight aluminum carrier called a sabot. The tungsten core was smaller in diameter than the gun barrel but far denser than steel. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. A smaller, denser projectile traveling at extreme velocity concentrated all its kinetic energy on a tiny impact point, dramatically increasing penetration. The lightweight aluminum sabot fell away after the shell left the barrel, allowing the dense tungsten dart to fly unencumbered toward its target. Where a standard 76mm M62 armor-piercing shell struck armor at roughly 2,600 feet per second, the HVAP round designated T4, or later M93, screamed in at approximately 3,400 feet per second, nearly 30% faster. This velocity difference translated into dramatically superior penetration. The numbers told the story. Standard 76mm M62 ammunition could penetrate approximately 116 mm of armor at 100 meters under ideal conditions with the plate set perpendicular to the line of fire. The same 76mm gun firing HVAP ammunition could punch through 202 mm at the same range. This was the difference between futility and lethality. The Tiger I, with its 100 mm of frontal armor, went from an impenetrable fortress to a vulnerable target. Even the Panther, with its ingeniously sloped 80 mm glassy plate that offered the equivalent protection of more than 140 mm against conventional rounds, could be defeated frontally by HVAP ammunition. Suddenly, the Tiger's frontal armor was no longer impenetrable to determined American crews. But there was a problem that no amount of engineering brilliance could solve. Tungsten, the critical component that made HVAP shells work, barely existed in the United States in quantities sufficient for ammunition production. Domestic production from mines scattered across Nevada, California, Colorado, and Arizona supplied only approximately 39% of American wartime tungsten needs. According to Mining History Journal analysis, the remaining 61% had to come from overseas, primarily from neutral Portugal and Spain, with smaller quantities from China and Bolivia. And tungsten was not merely needed for ammunition. The War Production Board had designated tungsten carbide a critical strategic material essential to virtually every aspect of modern industrial production. Machine tools required tungsten carbide cutting edges. Armor plate manufacturing consumed tungsten in hardening processes. Light bulb filaments, electrical contacts, and countless other components depended on this rare metal. When the War Production Board was forced to choose between shells for tankers and machine tools for the factories that produced tanks, aircraft, ships, and every other weapon of war, the factories won. Tungsten for HVAP ammunition became a lower priority than tungsten for industrial production, condemning American tankers to fight with nearly empty magazines. Portugal became the unlikely battleground of a desperate shadow war fought with dollars and diplomats rather than tanks and guns. Portuguese wolfram mines, wolfram being the European term for tungsten ore, produced roughly 6,500 metric tons in 1942. Both sides wanted every ounce, and both were willing to pay extraordinary prices to get it. Germany, which had relied on Portuguese tungsten imports since well before the war began, watched in alarm as prices increased nearly 800% above pre-war levels as Allied and Axis agents bid against each other for every available ton. The Allies countered German purchasing efforts with aggressive preemptive buying programs. British and American agents purchased wolfram or they did not need and could not use simply to keep it from reaching German hands. The strategy was expensive but effective. Every ton of tungsten bought by the Allies was a ton that would never harden German armor-piercing rounds or strengthen German armor plate. On June 5, 1944, exactly one day before the Normandy landings would transform the war in Western Europe, Portugal finally imposed a complete embargo on wolfram exports to Germany under intense Allied diplomatic pressure. The neutral nation had grown tired of the economic warfare being waged on its soil, but the damage to American HVAP production was already done and could not be quickly reversed. American industry never caught up with the demand for tungsten carbide ammunition during the critical months of the European campaign. Through January of 1945, nearly 8 months after D-Day, American manufacturers had produced only approximately 18,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP for all purposes, including training and testing. With roughly 10 weeks of shipping time required to move ammunition from American factories to frontline units in France, Belgium, and Germany, tank crews were fighting some of the heaviest armor battles of the war with almost empty magazines of the ammunition they needed most. The scarcity was crippling. By February 1945, the average Sherman tank equipped with a 76mm gun, itself an upgrade that had not reached most units until after D-Day, had received just 5 HVAP rounds total. Tank commanders treated these precious rounds like diamonds, hoarding them for absolutely confirmed Tiger or Panther sightings. They fired standard M62 ammunition at everything else: Panzer IVs, Sturmgeschütz assault guns, half-tracks, fortifications, even when it meant watching their shells bounce harmlessly off heavier German armor. Using an HVAP round on anything less than a certain Tiger or Panther felt like criminal waste. The bitter irony of the scarcity was that actual Tiger tanks themselves were extraordinarily rare on the battlefields where American forces fought. German industry had manufactured only 1,354 Tiger I tanks throughout the vehicle's entire production run. Fewer than 500 Tiger II King Tigers rolled off assembly lines before the war ended. By contrast, American factories produced nearly 50,000 Shermans of all types. Panthers, though more numerous than Tigers at roughly 6,000 vehicles produced, still represented a small fraction of total German armored strength. The overwhelming majority of German tanks and assault guns that American forces actually encountered were Panzer IVs, Sturmgeschütz IIIs, and various lighter vehicles that standard American ammunition could defeat without difficulty. But the psychological impact of Tigers far exceeded their actual numbers. Every German tank became a Tiger in the minds of terrified Sherman crews who had watched friends die in burning vehicles that could not fight back. After-action reports from Normandy routinely identified Panzer IVs, which weighed less than half as much as a Tiger and mounted a significantly less powerful gun, as Tiger tanks. Intelligence officers struggled to separate actual Tiger sightings from misidentifications. The Tiger legend fed on itself, growing with each retelling until it seemed that Wehrmacht panzer divisions consisted entirely of invincible steel monsters rather than the hodgepodge of vehicles they actually fielded. The story of American tankers versus actual Tigers is therefore largely a story that did not happen in Normandy. It was British and Canadian tankers who faced the great majority of Tiger engagements in the West during the summer of 1944. All 3 heavy SS Tiger battalions deployed to Normandy, designated the 101st, 102nd, and 503rd SS Heavy Panzer detachments, fought primarily in the British and Canadian sector around Caen in June and July. These units were assigned to support German forces defending against the repeated British offensives, Operations Epsom, Goodwood, and Atlantic, that sought to capture Caen and break out into the open tank country beyond. American units had remarkably few verified encounters with actual Tiger tanks throughout the entire Normandy campaign. American units had remarkably few verified encounters with actual Tiger tanks throughout the entire Normandy campaign. Historian Stephen Zaloga, widely regarded as the most authoritative English-language scholar of World War II armor, addressed this directly in his definitive study Armored Thunderbolt. Despite many United States Army accounts mentioning encounters with Tigers in Normandy, Zaloga wrote, there were in fact few or no engagements between American units and German Tiger battalions during this period. The vast majority of American claims of Tiger kills turned out upon post-war analysis to be misidentified Panzer IVs or Panthers. American tankers believed they were fighting Tigers because the psychological impact of the Tiger legend had become so pervasive that any German tank that could not be immediately destroyed was assumed to be a Tiger. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 changed everything. When Kampfgruppe paper, the armored spearhead of the German Ardennes offensive, smashed through American lines in the pre-dawn hours of December 16th, American units finally faced Tiger tanks in significant numbers. Schwer SS Panzer Abteilung 501, which had previously been designated the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Detachment before reorganization, had been completely re-equipped with King Tiger tanks for the offensive. The unit fielded approximately 45 King Tigers at the start of the operation, though this number fluctuated as vehicles broke down and were repaired or abandoned. These King Tigers represented the ultimate evolution of German heavy tank design. They mounted the powerful 88mm KWK-43 gun, a longer and more potent weapon than the Tiger I's KWK-36, with a 71 caliber barrel that generated significantly higher muzzle velocities and penetration. Their frontal armor reached 180 mm on the turret front, theoretically impervious to any tank gun the Americans possessed at normal combat ranges. At nearly 70 tons combat loaded, the King Tiger outweighed 2 Shermans and could theoretically destroy any Allied tank before that tank could close to effective range. They were the most formidable armored vehicles in the world. Yet the Ardennes offensive would demonstrate with terrible clarity that even the mightiest tanks could not overcome fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, impossible roads, and determined opposition. Kampfgruppe papers advanced ground to a halt not because American tanks defeated King Tigers in open combat, but because the Tigers ran out of fuel, broke down on narrow Belgian roads, and found bridges too weak to support their enormous weight. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and capture the vital supply port of Antwerp achieved none of its strategic objectives. At La Gleize, a small Belgian town nestled in the hills of the Ardennes, the offensive ground to its bitter end for Paper's force. The Kampfgruppe had outrun its fuel supplies, relying on captured American gasoline that proved insufficient for the thirsty Maybach engines of the King Tigers. American forces closed the ring around La Gleize, cutting off any possibility of resupply or reinforcement. Artillery and aircraft pounded the German positions. On Christmas Eve 1944, Paper made the agonizing decision to abandon his heavy equipment and break out on foot with his surviving men. When American soldiers cautiously entered La Gleize on Christmas morning, they found some of the most powerful weapons ever built sitting abandoned in farmyards and village streets. King Tiger 213 and King Tiger 221 sat at the outskirts of town, intact but immobilized for lack of fuel. Their crews had drained the last drops of gasoline trying to reach better defensive positions and had been forced to leave the vehicles where they stopped. American soldiers swarmed over the abandoned tanks, marveling at their massive size and sophisticated engineering. Many had never seen an actual Tiger before, having fought the entire war against an enemy that existed more in rumor than reality. Tiger 213 would survive to become the famous La Gleize Memorial, now one of the most visited World War II sites in Belgium. While Sherman tanks struggled against German armor, American tank destroyers proved surprisingly effective against Panthers and Tigers. The M36 Jackson tank destroyer mounted the same 90mm M3 gun that would eventually arm the Pershing heavy tank. This weapon could penetrate Tiger frontal armor at combat ranges, finally giving American forces a vehicle capable of fighting German heavy tanks on something approaching equal terms. The M36 entered combat in October 1944, just in time for the autumn fighting in the Rhineland and the winter battle of the Bulge. The lighter M18 Hellcat tank destroyer carried only the same 76mm gun as the improved Sherman, theoretically making it no more capable against heavy armor. But the Hellcat achieved remarkable success through a combination of speed, agility, and aggressive tactics. At nearly 50 miles per hour on roads, the Hellcat was the fastest tracked vehicle of the war. Its crews used the speed to outmaneuver German tanks, finding flanking positions where their guns could penetrate side armor while avoiding the frontal engagements where German tanks held every advantage. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion at Bastogne during the German offensive demonstrated what determined crews in light vehicles could accomplish. Fighting from hull-down positions around the besieged town, M18 crews destroyed between 39 and 43 German tanks, according to varying official tallies, while losing only 6 Hellcats in return. On Christmas Day alone, the same day American soldiers were exploring abandoned King Tigers at La Glise, M18 crews at Bastogne claimed 27 enemy armor kills. The light tank destroyer had achieved a kill ratio that heavy tank advocates could only dream about. The M26 Pershing heavy tank arrived too late to significantly affect the outcome of the war, but not too late to prove what American industry could have produced years earlier had headquarters opposition been overcome. Only 20 T-26E3 Pershing prototypes reached Europe before the end of February 1945, assigned to the 3rd Armored Division and 9th Armored Division for combat evaluation. The Pershing mounted the 90mm M3 gun in a turret protected by over 100mm of armor. It could finally fight German heavy tanks on equal terms in the head-to-head engagements that McNair had insisted would never happen. The Pershing's first major engagement demonstrated both its capabilities and its vulnerabilities at Elsdorf, Germany. On February 26, 1945, Pershing No. 38, nicknamed Fireball by its crew, approached a road junction when a concealed German tank opened fire without warning. Tiger 211 of Heavy Panzer Battalion 301, a specialized unit that normally operated radio-controlled demolition vehicles, struck the Pershing 3 times in rapid succession. At least 1 round penetrated the hull, killing 2 crewmen and knocking Fireball out of action. The Pershing was not invincible. Even American heavy tanks could be destroyed by German 88mm guns. But Fireball would be recovered and repaired, and redemption came quickly. The next day, February 27th, Sergeant Nicholas Mashlonik commanded Pershing No. 40 in the continued fighting around Elsdorf. Mashlonik spotted a dug-in Tiger I tank and 2 Panzer IVs positioned to ambush advancing American forces. Using T-30E-16 HVAP ammunition loaded in his 90mm gun, Mashlonik engaged the Tiger at between 900 and 1,000 yards, accounts varying slightly on the exact range. His first round punched cleanly through the Tiger's frontal armor, destroying the tank instantly. He eliminated both Panzer IVs in rapid succession before they could effectively respond. The 90mm HVAP round had finally delivered on the promise that tungsten scarcity had denied to 76mm crews for the entire preceding year. The most famous tank engagement of the entire war in Europe occurred a week later, though it involved a Panther rather than a Tiger. On March 6, 1945, Sergeant Clarence Smoyer served as gunner in a Pershing supporting the American assault on the city of Cologne. Near the famous cathedral, its twin spires damaged but still standing amid the devastation of Allied bombing, a German Panther from Panzer Brigade 106 lay in wait. A Tiger that could not be maintained became a Tiger that could not fight. And maintaining Tigers in field conditions proved extraordinarily difficult. American forces discovered this mechanical vulnerability repeatedly throughout the campaign. Advancing units found abandoned Tigers with what appeared to be minor mechanical problems, stuck in mud, thrown tracks, failed transmissions, that German crews simply could not repair without specialized equipment and spare parts that were not available at the front. The Tiger that American tankers feared so deeply was often its own worst enemy, defeated not by armor-piercing shells, but by broken final drives and empty fuel tanks. American tank crews developed their own legendary figures during the European campaign. Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole earned the nickname War Daddy during 81 days of continuous combat operations with the 3rd Armored Division in the summer of 1944. During this remarkable period, Poole and his crew destroyed 12 enemy tanks and approximately 258 other armored vehicles and self-propelled guns. These figures were counted separately, the tanks being verified kills against armored opposition while the larger number represented all categories of enemy vehicles destroyed. Poole survived the loss of 3 successive Sherman tanks, each time escaping his burning vehicle to fight another day in a new tank. His luck finally ran out on September 19, 1944, when a German Panther penetrated his 3rd Sherman, in the Mood, near the Siegfried Line. The explosion cost Poole his right leg, ending his combat career just short of 3 months of continuous action. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for his extraordinary valor and lived until 1991. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division with such tactical brilliance that General George Patton himself, one of the most accomplished armor commanders in American history, publicly declared Abrams his equal. Patton's exact words passed into Army legend and have been quoted in official histories. "I am supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army," Patton said, "but I have one peer, Abe Abrams. He is the world champion." On December 26, 1944, Abrams led the Armored Relief Column that finally broke through German lines to reach besieged Bastogne after days of desperate fighting through snow and enemy resistance. The relief of Bastogne became one of the iconic moments of the Battle of the Bulge, and Abrams's role in achieving it secured his reputation as one of America's finest combat commanders. He would survive the war, rise to the rank of 4-star general, serve as Army Chief of Staff during the Vietnam War, and give his name to the M1 Abrams main battle tank that remains America's primary armored vehicle to this day. The Isigny firing tests of August 1944 provided scientific confirmation of what American tankers already knew from bitter combat experience. Ordnance officers set up captured German Panther tanks as targets and fired standard M62 armor-piercing ammunition at them from 76mm guns at various ranges and angles. The results were deeply discouraging. Round after round failed to penetrate the Panther's sloped glassy plate. The official report declared M62 ammunition unsatisfactory for use against heavy armored targets. The underlying phenomenon that caused these failures would later be termed the shatter gap by armor researchers. At high impact velocities above approximately 2,700 feet per second, certain armor-piercing projectiles paradoxically shattered rather than penetrated. The projectile's own speed worked against it, causing the hardened steel body to fragment on impact rather than remaining intact to push through the armor plate. The faster the shell traveled, the more likely it was to shatter uselessly against sloped armor. HVAP ammunition with its tungsten carbide core did not suffer from this problem. Tungsten carbide maintained structural cohesion at virtually any achievable impact velocity, punching through armor rather than shattering against it. This was one of the key technical advantages of HVAP beyond its raw penetration numbers. The tungsten dart remained intact and effective where steel projectiles failed. By the spring of 1945, HVAP production had finally increased enough to make a meaningful difference in the dwindling battles of a war that was clearly approaching its end. The 90mm M304 HVAP round achieved approximately 238mm of penetration at 100 meters, enough to defeat any German tank at virtually any angle, including frontal shots against King Tigers. But the war was ending. The Tigers and Panthers that had terrorized American tankers in Normandy and the Ardennes were burning hulks scattered across Germany or captured trophies being shipped back to Aberdeen for analysis. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, had his own reckoning with the ammunition crisis. In a meeting with ordnance officers in the summer of 1944, Eisenhower learned for the first time that the 76mm gun could not reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor. His reaction became legendary among those present. "You mean our 76 will not knock these Panthers out?" Eisenhower demanded. "Why? I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war. Why is it that I am always the last to hear about this stuff? Ordnance told me the 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you cannot knock out a damn thing with it." The Supreme Commander's frustration reflected the failure of information to flow from proving ground to headquarters, leaving senior commanders unaware of the inadequacy of American tank armament until frontline troops had already paid the price. The contrast between German quality and American quantity became starkest in the final statistics of the tank war. Combined production of Tiger I and Tiger II variants barely exceeded 1,800 tanks across 3 years of total war. American factories, by contrast, achieved production rates that seemed almost impossible by European standards. The Detroit tank arsenal alone could produce more Shermans in a single month than Germany produced Tigers in an entire year. When Ford's Willow Run facility finally reached full production, it was turning out a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. The same industrial philosophy applied to tank production. American factories were not trying to build the best tank in the world. They were trying to build enough good tanks to bury the best tanks in the world under sheer numbers. By that measure, they succeeded completely. American factories turned out approximately 50,000 Sherman tanks of all variants during the war compared to roughly 6,000 Panthers and fewer than 2,000 Tigers of both types combined. The ratio was staggering. For every Tiger Germany built, America produced nearly 30 Shermans. For every Panther, America produced 8 Shermans. Even if every German tank destroyed 5 Shermans before being knocked out, which they did not, America would still have tanks left over at the end. Whatever the individual quality differences between vehicles, the sheer weight of American production overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. Numbers had won where quality alone had failed. The lesson of HVAP was ultimately not that American technology had triumphed over German engineering, but that American technology had arrived too late to save the men who needed it most. Tungsten scarcity, headquarters obstruction, rigid doctrine, and bureaucratic inertia had combined to deny frontline troops the weapons they needed during the critical months when those weapons would have made the greatest difference. Hundreds of American tankers died in burning Shermans because the shells that could have saved them sat in warehouses waiting for tungsten allocations that were never approved or remained unproduced because factories had not received priority authorization. The strange shell that could shatter Tigers existed primarily in small unit actions and individual legends rather than as a war-winning weapon deployed in decisive quantities. Most American tankers who served in the European theater never received enough HVAP rounds to significantly affect their combat capabilities. They fought with what they had, M62 ammunition that bounced off Panther glacis plates and Tiger frontal armor, and they adapted as soldiers always adapt. They learned to avoid frontal engagements with German heavy armor whenever possible, seeking flanking positions where their guns could penetrate thinner side and rear armor. They called in air strikes from fighter bombers armed with rockets and bombs that could destroy any tank regardless of armor thickness. They worked closely with infantry to blind German crews with smoke grenades while tanks maneuvered into better positions. They developed tactical approaches that minimized their technological disadvantage through superior coordination and aggressive small unit leadership. When HVAP rounds did arrive, tank commanders used them with devastating precision, saving the precious tungsten ammunition for the moments when nothing else would do. The strange shell became the ace in the hole, the desperate measure for desperate circumstances, and the round that a good gunner kept ready for the confirmed Tiger sighting that might come at any moment. The abandoned King Tigers at La Glise stand today as monuments to the limits of engineering excellence divorced from industrial and logistical reality. The most advanced tanks in the world could not overcome fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, inadequate logistics, and the 1,000 other requirements of modern mechanized warfare. German engineers had built a nearly perfect fighting machine and then discovered that perfect machines require perfect support systems that Germany could not provide. The M93 HVAP round sits in museums and private collections, its tungsten carbide core a physical reminder of scarcity and improvisation. The Pershing arrived too late to change the outcome of the European War but proved the principle that would guide American armor development for the next 80 years. Speed, firepower, and protection all mattered. Doctrine had to follow technology rather than constrain it. The lessons paid for in American blood in 1944 and 1945 were not forgotten. When German gunners first encountered HVAP ammunition at combat ranges, they discovered that American desperation had produced American innovation. The strange shell they had dismissed was no longer strange. It was deadly, and for the crews of shattered Tigers and burning Panthers, it was the last thing they ever saw. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you the untold stories of history's greatest conflicts. Hit the bell icon to be notified when new videos drop, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What other overlooked weapons, technologies, or untold stories from World War II would you like us to explore? Your suggestions directly shape our future content. Until next time, thank you for watching.